It is every parent's worst nightmare. A stranger, a gun, and your children stolen in an instant. On the night of October 25th, 1994, that nightmare appeared to become a horrifying reality in the small, quiet town of Union, South Carolina. A young, terrified mother named Susan Smith stood before television cameras, her face etched with anguish, and delivered a tearful, desperate plea for the safe return of her two little boys. A nation watched, wept with her, and prayed for a miracle. But what if the tears were a lie? What if the grieving mother wasn't a victim, but the monster who had orchestrated the entire tragedy? The story Susan Smith told was chillingly believable. She claimed that while stopped at a red light, a black man had forced his way into her Mazda protégé at gunpoint. After a short drive, he ordered her out of the car and sped away with her two sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, still strapped helplessly in their car seats in the back. The report sparked an immediate and massive response. The FBI was called in, and a frantic 9-day manhunt ensued. The story dominated national headlines. The faces of Michael and Alex, smiling and innocent, were broadcast across the country. Yellow ribbons were tied around trees in Union, prayer vigils were held, and the entire nation rallied behind Susan and her estranged husband, David, the heartbroken parents caught in an unthinkable tragedy. On camera, Susan and David pleaded for their children's lives. "I don't know who you are or why you've taken my children," Susan sobbed into the microphones, "but please, for the love of God, bring my children back to me." Her performance was convincing. She appeared to be a mother shattered by grief, a symbol of every parent's deepest fear. But as the days wore on, investigators began to notice disturbing cracks in her story. Her description of the carjacker was impossibly vague. She seemed strangely unemotional during intense police interviews, and she failed a series of polygraph tests. The focus of the investigation slowly, horrifyingly, began to shift from a mysterious, armed stranger to the grieving mother herself. Detectives dug into Susan's personal life and uncovered a powerful motive. She was engaged in a secret affair with a wealthy local man named Tom Findley. But Findley had recently broken up with her, writing her a letter explicitly stating that while he cared for her, he was not ready for a ready-made family and did not want the responsibility of her children. For Susan, her own sons had become obstacles to the life of wealth and romance she desperately craved. The timeline was damning. Findley's letter had arrived just over a week before the boys disappeared. On the 9th day of the search, Sheriff Howard Wells confronted Susan with the mountain of inconsistencies in her story. He gently told her, "We knew there was no carjacker." And with that, the facade shattered. Susan Smith broke down and confessed to a crime so monstrous it sent a shockwave of horror across the world. There was no black man. There was no carjacking. It was all a lie, a racist fabrication designed to hide an unthinkable truth. She admitted that she had driven her two sons to the quiet, dark edge of John D. Long Lake. There, she got out of the car, released the handbrake, and watched in the darkness as the vehicle slowly rolled down the boat ramp and into the murky water, her children trapped inside. For 9 days, while a nation prayed for their safety, Susan Smith knew that her sons were at the bottom of that lake, drowned by her own hand. The recovery of the car was a moment of national trauma. A dive team located the Mazda, submerged in 18 feet of water. As it was pulled to the surface, the haunting image of the two small boys, still strapped into their car seats, was broadcast to a horrified public. The motive was as chilling as the crime itself. She had murdered her children in the cold-blooded hope that it would clear the way for her to be with a man who didn't want them. The trial was a media spectacle. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, portraying her as a cold, calculating, and narcissistic killer who had used a racist stereotype to try and get away with murder. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They detailed Susan's deeply troubled past, including a history of depression, a suicide attempt as a teenager, and the horrific sexual abuse she had endured for years at the hands of her own stepfather. They argued that she was not a monster, but a deeply disturbed and fragile woman who had suffered a psychotic break. In July 1995, the jury found Susan Smith guilty of 2 counts of murder. However, after hearing the details of her traumatic past, they chose to spare her life, sentencing her to life in prison. As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, Susan Smith is 53 years old and is incarcerated at Leith Correctional Institution in South Carolina. She became eligible for parole for the first time in November 2024, a prospect that sparked widespread public outrage and petitions to keep her locked away forever. Our story remains one of the most infamous cases of maternal filicide in American history, a horrifying saga of deception, betrayal, and a mother's love that twisted into the ultimate act of evil. When a mother's children are brutalized by a random act of violence, the world expects to see a soul shattered by grief. We expect tears, desperation, and an all-consuming pain. But what if instead we see smiles? What if the mother's interviews are strangely calm, her stories inconsistent, and her focus seems to be anywhere but on her dying children? And what if the only surviving witness, a little girl who fought her way back from the brink of death, points not to a monster in the dark, but directly back at her own mother? On the night of May 19th, 1983, a blood-spatter Nason pulsar sped to the emergency room entrance of a hospital in Springfield, Oregon. Inside was 27-year-old Diane Downs and her 3 children, all suffering from gunshot wounds. 7-year-old Cheryl was already dead. 8-year-old Christy and 3-year-old Danny were clinging to life, their small bodies riddled with bullets. Diane herself had a minor wound to her forearm. Her story was a portrait of roadside terror. She claimed a bushy-haired stranger had flagged her down on a dark rural road, attempted to carjack her, and then shot them all before vanishing into the night. It was a horrifying account that should have elicited nothing but sympathy. But from the moment she arrived at the hospital, Diane Downs' behavior was deeply unsettling. As doctors frantically worked to save her children, she seemed eerily composed. Her primary concern, according to hospital staff, was not the condition of her son and daughter, but the location of a man named Robert Knickerbocker, a married man she had been excessively pursuing. Investigators found her demeanor to be just as bizarre. Her timeline of events kept changing, and her emotional state fluctuated wildly. One moment she would be sobbing, the next she would be cracking jokes. The nation got its first look at this strange behavior when she agreed to a televised interview. Smiling, confident, and almost cheerful, she calmly reenacted the shooting for the cameras, a performance so detached from the expected grief of a mother that it sent a chill down the spine of everyone watching, including the detectives working her case. The investigation quickly pivoted from a phantom stranger to Diane herself. Detectives discovered her diaries, which revealed a deep and all-consuming obsession with Robert Knickerbocker. The journals were filled with desperate entries about her love for him and her frustration with her children, who she saw as an obstacle to her happiness. Knickerbocker had made it clear he loved his wife and had no interest in being a father to Diane's kids. For Diane, the solution was chillingly simple. If her children were gone, the one thing standing between her and the man she loved would be removed forever. The motive was the same selfish, romantic fantasy that had driven others to commit the unthinkable. While the circumstantial evidence was mounting, prosecutors knew their case was missing a crucial piece: a direct witness. That witness was lying in a hospital bed, having survived a catastrophic stroke from the shooting that had left her unable to speak. For months, Christy Downs, Diane's 8-year-old daughter, underwent intensive therapy. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to recover. The district attorney, Fred Hudy, would visit her regularly, building a gentle rapport. Finally, the day came when he felt she was ready. He asked her the question that would seal her mother's fate. "Christy," he asked, "who shot you?" After a long pause, the little girl gave her simple, devastating answer. "No, Mom." The trial of Diane Downs was one of the most sensational of its era. On the stand, Christy, a small and fragile but incredibly brave witness, recounted the horrifying events of that night. She told the court how her mother had pulled the car over, reached for a gun, and shot all three of them. Her testimony was the emotional and legal centerpiece of the trial. Diane, meanwhile, continued her bizarre performance. She showed up to court pregnant with another man's child, a baffling attempt to present herself as a loving maternal figure, even as she was being tried for murdering two of her children and attempting to murder the third. The jury saw through the act. In June 1984, Diane Downs was found guilty of 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, plus 50 years. During her sentencing, she remained defiant, still proclaiming her innocence. "I have not murdered my children," she told the judge, her voice filled with a theatrical indignation that had become her trademark. Her story took one final, dramatic turn. In 1987, she executed a daring escape from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center, climbing over a fence and remaining at large for 10 days before she was recaptured. It was a final act of the arrogance and cunning that had defined her from the start. As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, Diane Downs is 70 years old and remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Her surviving children, Christy and Danny, were adopted by the lead prosecutor on her case and have gone on to live full lives, shielded from the woman who tried to erase them. Diane Downs has been denied parole at every hearing, where she continues to maintain her innocence, still blaming the bushy-haired stranger for a crime the world knows she committed. Her case is a chilling study in sociopathy, a look at a mother whose desire for a man was so absolute that she was willing to sacrifice her own children to achieve it. Another's instinct is to protect her children, to shield them from harm, and to nurture them with unconditional love. But what happens when that instinct becomes poisoned by a broken mind? What happens when a devoutly religious mother, suffering from one of the most severe forms of mental illness, comes to believe that the only way to save her children's souls from eternal damnation is to methodically kill them herself? To the outside world, the Yates family of Clear Lake, Texas, a suburb of Houston, seemed to be living a version of the American dream. Andrea Yates was a former nurse and a dedicated stay-at-home mother. Her husband, Rusty, was a NASA engineer. They lived in a modest but comfortable home with their 5 bright and beautiful children: 7-year-old Noah, 5-year-old John, 3-year-old Paul, 2-year-old Luke, and 6-month-old Mary. They were a devout Christian family, and Andrea poured all of her energy into homeschooling and raising her children. But beneath this idyllic facade, Andrea was fighting a desperate, silent war against a mental illness that was consuming her. Her battle with severe postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis was long and well documented. Following the birth of her 4th son, she suffered a complete mental breakdown, attempting suicide twice and being hospitalized multiple times. Doctors diagnosed her with a severe psychotic disorder and explicitly warned her and Rusty that having another child could trigger a catastrophic psychotic event. Despite this, they had a 5th child, Mary. As the doctors had feared, Andrea's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She was consumed by religious delusions, believing she was a wicked, irredeemable woman who had failed as a mother. She became convinced that her children, because of her failings, were not developing correctly and were destined for an eternity in hell. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Rusty Yates left for work, leaving Andrea alone with their 5 children. It was the last time he would see them alive. In the quiet of her suburban home, Andrea's delusions reached their horrific conclusion. She believed Satan was inside her, and that the only way to save her children from being tormented by him forever was to send them to heaven. And the only way to do that was to kill them one by one in a methodical and terrifying sequence. She drowned each of her high in the mixed. One by one, in a methodology and terrifying sequence, she drowned each of her children. One by one, in a methodology and a terror, unpunished. She started with the boys, and when her eldest, Noah, walked in and asked what was wrong with his baby sister, she chased him through the house, dragged him back to the bathroom, and forced him under the water as he fought for his life. She then laid their small bodies on her bed and covered them with a sheet. After the horrific act was complete, she calmly called 911. When the operator asked what the problem was, she replied in a flat, emotionless voice, "I just killed my kids." She then immediately called her husband. "It's time," she told him. "I did it." When police arrived, they found the woman completely detached from the horror she had just unleashed, her mind apparently broken beyond recognition. The case of Andrea Yates immediately sparked a furious national debate and a complex legal battle that hinged on a single, profound question. Was she a cold-blooded monster or a critically ill patient? At her first trial in 2002, prosecutors argued that despite her illness, she knew her actions were legally and morally wrong, and therefore she was legally sane. They pointed to the methodical nature of the killings as evidence of a conscious mind at work. The key and controversial piece of their case came from a forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Park Dietz, who testified that Andrea may have gotten the idea to plead insanity from an episode of the TV show Law and Order. The jury agreed with the prosecution, found her guilty of capital murder, and sentenced her to life in prison. The story, however, was far from over. Years later, it was discovered that Dr. Dietz's testimony had been false. No such episode of Law and Order had ever existed. This stunning revelation was enough for an appeals court to overturn her conviction in 2005, granting her a new trial. At her second trial in 2006, the defense presented a much more robust and compassionate picture of the severity of her psychosis. This time, the jury saw her not as a calculating killer, but as a woman so ravaged by her delusions that she had lost all connection to reality. They found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. She was not set free. Instead, she was committed to a high-security state mental hospital where she would receive the psychiatric treatment she had so desperately needed for years. As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, Andrea Yates, now 60 years old, remains a patient at the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas. Her life is a quiet and structured routine of therapy and anonymous work within the facility. She reportedly spends her time creating art and watching home videos of the children she lost. Each year, she is eligible to be reviewed for a potential release, but each year, she waives that right, choosing to remain in the hospital. Her case forced a profound change in the American legal system and public consciousness, shedding a harsh light on the devastating realities of postpartum psychosis and forever changing the conversation about the intersection of motherhood, mental illness, and criminal justice. In the quiet suburbs, a family's love is often measured in simple gestures: a shared meal, a cold drink on a warm day, the quiet hum of a normal life. But what if those gestures are a mask for a creeping, homicidal resentment? What if the Gatorade in the fridge is laced with poison, and a loving mother decides her family members are not people, but obstacles, burdens to be erased with a tasteless, odorless chemical she bought at the local auto parts store? In Springfield, Missouri, Diane Staudte was known as a dedicated wife, a mother of 4, and a talented church organist. She and her husband Mark, a popular local musician, lived in a modest home where they raised their children. To the outside world, they were a normal, if sometimes struggling, family. But behind closed doors, Diane was cultivating a secret and deadly hatred for the life she had built. She saw her husband as lazy, her autistic son as a pest, and one of her daughters as a financial drain. And so, with a chilling and methodical patience, she decided to eliminate them. The first tragedy struck on Easter Sunday, 2012. Her husband, 61-year-old Mark Staudte, died suddenly. Doctors, finding no obvious signs of foul play, attributed his death to natural causes. Diane, the grieving widow, collected on a modest life insurance policy, and life went on. No one suspected a thing. Just 5 months later, death visited the Staudte home again. Her 26-year-old son, Sean, who had autism and had suffered a brain injury in an ATV accident years earlier, was found dead in his room. Once again, the death was attributed to his pre-existing medical conditions. 2 family members dead in less than 6 months. To the community, it was a string of unimaginable bad luck. To Diane, it was phase 2 of her plan. Her third target was her 24-year-old daughter, Sarah. Sarah, a college graduate with student loan debt and no job, was, in Diane's cold calculus, another burden. In June of 2013, Sarah was rushed to the hospital with severe flu-like symptoms, her kidneys and other organs failing catastrophically. Doctors were baffled. They couldn't determine the cause of her sudden, life-threatening illness. As Sarah lay in a hospital bed fighting for her life, the truth finally began to surface. Not from a doctor, but from an anonymous tipster. A pastor at Diane's church, concerned by her dark and callous jokes about her husband's and son's deaths, called the police and suggested they take a closer look. Investigators brought Diane in for questioning. At first, she played the part of a devastated mother, overwhelmed by yet another family tragedy. But as detectives pressed her with inconsistencies, the facade crumbled. In a calm, almost casual confession, she admitted to everything. She told them she had poisoned her husband and son by lacing their favorite drinks, Gatorade and Coca-Cola, with antifreeze. She described her motives with a terrifying lack of emotion. She said she hated her husband's guts and that her son Sean was worse than a pest. She had murdered them, she explained, to free herself. She then admitted she was in the process of doing the same thing to Sarah, slowly poisoning her over 4 days because she wouldn't get a job and had student loan debt. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As Diane confessed, she implicated a co-conspirator, an accomplice who had not only known about the murders, but had actively participated in the plot to kill her siblings. That accomplice was her favorite daughter, 22-year-old Rachel Staudte. When investigators brought Rachel in, she too confessed. She admitted she knew her mother had killed her father and had helped her plan the murder of her brother Sean. She then confirmed she was part of the ongoing plot to poison her sister, Sarah. Their motive was the same. They saw their family members as annoyances to be disposed of. The investigation uncovered a trove of chilling evidence, including Diane's personal diary. It was filled with dark, rambling poetry and a cold countdown to her husband's death. "I am putting this on here so I can vent and not explode," she wrote, before detailing her growing hatred. "It's sad he has to go, but he is not a man." When police searched the home, they found the bottle of antifreeze, a clear and undeniable murder weapon. Faced with the death penalty, Diane Staudte pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. In 2016, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rachel, who testified against her mother as part of a plea deal, also pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 2 life sentences, but with the possibility of parole, a concession made in exchange for her cooperation. As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, both Diane and Rachel Staudte remain incarcerated in Missouri. Diane, now in her 60s, is at the Chillicothe Correctional Center, where she will spend the rest of her life. Miraculously, her daughter Sarah survived the poisoning, the states with a mob packed with fire, leaving the public death of a terrible pain. The story of the Staudte family is a horrifying look at how the most mundane aspects of family life can be twisted into weapons, and how a mother's love can curdle into a cold, murderous poison. A mother's devotion to her sick child is one of the most powerful and celebrated forces on earth. We see these women as heroes, selfless saints sacrificing everything for the well-being of their children, and we shower them with sympathy and support. But what if that devotion is a lie? What if the endless list of illnesses is a complete fabrication, and the mother is the one keeping her child sick, all for a twisted need for attention? And what happens when that child, after a lifetime of medical torture, decides the only way to be free is through murder? To the world, Blanchard and her daughter, Gypsy Rose, were an inspirational portrait of love and resilience. Living in a pink house in Springfield, Missouri, built for them by Habitat for Humanity, they were local celebrities. Dee was the tireless, doting single mother, and Gypsy was the sweet, eternally optimistic girl with the high-pitched voice, confined to a wheelchair, a bald head, a testament to her battle with leukemia. Their story was heartbreaking. Gypsy, they said, suffered from muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, severe asthma, and a host of other ailments. She required a feeding tube to eat and was always seen with an oxygen tank. They were showered with charity, receiving free trips to Disney World, backstage concert passes, and the unending admiration of their community. Dee was a hero. Gypsy was a medical miracle. But the entire story was a monstrous lie. The truth was that Gypsy Rose Blanchard was perfectly healthy. She didn't have cancer, she didn't have muscular dystrophy, and she did not need a wheelchair. She was the victim of one of the most extreme documented cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental illness where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in someone under their care to gain attention and sympathy. For nearly 2 decades, Dee subjected her daughter to a life of systematic medical torture. She shaved Gypsy's head to mimic the effects of chemotherapy. She forced her to use a feeding tube, leading to unnecessary surgeries and the rotting of her teeth. She had doctors perform procedures on Gypsy's eyes and even had her salivary glands removed. Every time a doctor came close to discovering the fraud, Dee would simply pack up and move to a new town with a new set of physicians, always one step ahead of the truth. Gypsy spent her entire childhood as a prisoner in a phantom illness, believing for much of it that she was truly sick. But as she entered her teenage years, she began to understand the deception. She knew she could walk. She knew she could eat without a feeding tube, but she was trapped, controlled by a mother who enforced the lie with physical and psychological abuse. Her only escape was the internet. Secretly, she created online dating profiles, and in 2012, she connected with a man named Nicholas Gojon. In their hidden online world, Gypsy could finally be herself, a healthy young woman, desperate for love and freedom. Their online romance blossomed into a dark conspiracy, as they came to believe there was only one way for Gypsy to escape her mother's control. On the night of June 9, 2015, the plan was put into motion. Gypsy let Nicholas Gojon into the pink house, while her mother, Dee, was asleep. As Gypsy hid in the bathroom with her hands over her ears, Gojon entered Dee's bedroom and stabbed her to death. Afterward, the couple fled to Gojon's home in Wisconsin. For several days, no one knew Dee was dead. The final, bizarre act that unraveled their crime came from Gypsy herself. To alert the world to what had happened, she logged onto the Facebook account she shared with her mother and posted a chilling, cryptic message. "That bitch is dead." The post caused immediate alarm among their friends and neighbors. who called the police. When officers entered the home, they found Dee Dee's body and a trail that led them directly to Wisconsin. When Gypsy Rose and Nicholas Gojon were arrested, the world was stunned by the revelation that was about to unfold. As she was escorted into the police station, Gypsy stood up from her wheelchair and walked on her own 2 feet. The shocking truth was revealed. The sick little girl was a healthy adult, and the heroic mother was a manipulative, monstrous abuser. The legal fallout was as complex as the crime itself. Nicholas Gojon was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the world saw Gypsy Rose in a different light. She was not just a killer, she was a survivor of decades of unimaginable torture. In a plea deal that acknowledged her extreme circumstances, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to just 10 years in prison. As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, the story has taken another turn. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was released from prison on parole in December of 2023, after serving 8 years of her sentence. Now in her 30s, she has become a paradoxical public figure, a convicted murderer who is also a celebrated advocate against child abuse, a newfound freedom chronicled by millions on social media. While Dee Dee Blanchard was the ultimate victim of the crime, she is remembered as the architect of a tragedy, an evil mother whose case remains a deeply disturbing and cautionary tale about the terrifying power of deception and the desperate, violent lengths a person will go to in order to break free. The role of a stepmother is a delicate one, a journey of building trust and love with a child who is not your own. It is a promise to care for and protect them as one of your own. But what happens when that role is twisted into a mask for pure, unadulterated hatred? What happens when a woman, entrusted with the care of a vulnerable little girl, decides not just to neglect her, but to systematically and deliberately starve her to death, all while feeding her own children in the very next room? 10-year-old Emani Moss was a child caught between worlds. Her biological mother had lost custody, leaving her in the full-time care of her father, Emani, and her stepmother, Tiffany Moss. The couple lived in a suburban apartment in Lawrenceville, Georgia, with their 2 biological children. To the outside world, they were a blended family, but within the walls of their home, a horrifying and deadly distinction was being made. While Tiffany's own children were fed, clothed, and cared for, Emani was treated as less than human, an object of a deep and murderous resentment. The abuse was a slow, agonizing, and deliberate descent into hell. Tiffany began to systematically starve her young stepdaughter, locking her away in a bare bedroom, isolating her from the rest of the family. Emani was denied food for weeks on end, her small body wasting away, while the sounds of a normal family life carried on just outside her door. The cruelty was not just passive neglect, it was active and sadistic. Prosecutors later revealed that Tiffany would send her husband photos of the meals she had lovingly prepared for their other children, a taunting reminder of the nourishment Emani was being denied. The motive, they argued, stemmed from a bitter grudge. Tiffany blamed Emani for a previous child cruelty conviction that had caused her to lose her job as a preschool teacher. That bitterness festered and evolved into a hatred so profound that it became a death sentence. By October of 2013, Emani's body, deprived of nutrients for so long, finally gave out. She weighed just 32 pounds, the average weight of a 3-year-old. But the horror did not end with her death. Instead of seeking help or showing a shred of remorse, Tiffany and her husband, Emani, embarked on a grotesque attempt to cover up their crime. They bought a galvanized steel trash can, stuffed Emani's tiny, emaciated body inside, and attempted to burn her remains to ash. When their crude cremation failed, they simply dumped the trash can in a wooded area and went on with their lives. The discovery of the body by maintenance workers a few days later finally brought their horrific secret into the light. The legal fallout was swift. Emani Moss, the father who stood by and did nothing while his daughter starved, pleaded guilty to felony murder, to avoid the death penalty. He agreed to testify against his wife and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This left Tiffany Moss to face justice alone, and the way she chose to face it would become one of the most bizarre and chilling chapters in Georgia's legal history. For her own capital murder trial in 2019, a trial where her life was on the line, Tiffany Moss chose to act as her own attorney. From the moment the trial began, she sat in a stunning and defiant silence. She made no opening statement to the jury. She called no witnesses in her own defense. She did not cross-examine a single one of the state's witnesses, not even her husband, who detailed their horrific crimes from the stand. She presented no evidence, offered no alternative theory, and gave no explanation for her actions. As prosecutors presented horrifying, graphic photos of Emani's wasted body and described the agony of her final days, Tiffany Moss stared ahead, her face a blank mask of indifference. She showed absolutely no emotion, no sadness, no regret. Her silence was deafening. It was a void that the prosecution filled with the brutal facts of the case. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding her guilty of all charges, including malice murder. During the sentencing phase, as prosecutors argued for the death penalty, Tiffany Moss again remained silent. The jury heard a heartbreaking audio recording of Emani pleading with her father, her voice weak and desperate. It took them less than 3 hours to decide her fate. On April 30th, 2019, the jury sentenced Tiffany Moss to death by lethal injection.
As to penalty, count 1, murder, we, the jury, recommend and fix the penalty as death.
She became the only woman on Georgia's death row. As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, Tiffany Moss remains on death row at Arundel State Prison in Georgia, awaiting her execution. Her silence, in the face of overwhelming evidence of her own monstrous cruelty, has become her legacy. It was not the silence of a victim, but the cold, empty silence of a woman who had successfully erased a child she grew to hate and felt absolutely nothing. A mother's love is supposed to be the most powerful, protective force in a child's life, an unconditional bond that can never be broken. But what happens when that mother falls under the spell of a doomsday prophet? What if she comes to believe that her own children are no longer human, that their bodies have been possessed by dark spirits, and that the most righteous, even loving, act she can perform is to have them murdered and buried in a backyard? For years, Lori Vallow appeared to be a vibrant and devoted mother, a former beauty pageant contestant with a radiant smile. She was raising 2 children in Arizona, her teenage daughter, Caylee Ryan, and her young adopted son, JJ Vallow, who had special needs. She was a dedicated member of the Mormon Church, and to the outside world, she was a loving matriarch. But in 2018, her life took a dark and bizarre turn when she met Chad Daybell, a former cemetery groundskeeper turned self-published author of apocalyptic fiction. Together, they would descend into a world of fringe religious extremism that would leave a trail of dead bodies in its wake. Chad Daybell was not just an author, he was the charismatic leader of his own small doomsday cult. He preached that he was a prophet who could see into the spirit world. He and Lori came to believe they were chosen leaders in the Church of the Firstborn, destined to guide the 144,000 righteous survivors after the apocalypse, which they believed would occur in July of 2020. Central to their bizarre theology was the concept of zombies. They believed that when a person's spirit left their body, it could be replaced by a dark entity. The only way to free the original spirit was to destroy the possessed body. This twisted belief system became their justification for murder. As their affair intensified, the people they saw as obstacles to their divine mission began to die. In July 2019, Lori's 4th husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed by her brother, Alex Cox. Cox claimed self-defense, and the case was initially closed. Just 3 months later, Chad Daybell's wife of nearly 30 years, Tammy, died in her sleep. Her death was ruled natural, and no autopsy was performed. With their spouses gone, Lori and Chad were free to be together, but there were still 2 obstacles left: Lori's children, Caylee and JJ. In September 2019, shortly after moving the children to Rexburg, Idaho, to be closer to Chad, Caylee and JJ vanished. The last known image of Caylee was from a family trip to Yellowstone National Park. The last time anyone saw JJ was at his elementary school a few weeks later. Lori withdrew him, claiming she was going to homeschool him. As friends and family grew increasingly worried, Lori spun a web of lies, telling some that Caylee was studying at a university and others that JJ was with a family friend in Arizona. All the while, she continued to collect the Social Security and survivor benefits the children were entitled to. The most brazen and chilling act came just 2 weeks after Chad's wife died, and while her own children were still missing. Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell flew to Hawaii and got married on a sun-drenched beach. Photos from the wedding show them smiling, laughing, and celebrating their new life together, a grotesque display of indifference, while the world was beginning to ask the terrifying question, where are the children? The official investigation was kicked off in November 2019 by JJ's grandparents, who called the police for a welfare check. Lori and Chad lied to the police, who soon realized the children were gone. The case exploded into a national media firestorm. Even under a court order to produce her children, Lori refused, missing the deadline and eventually being arrested in Hawaii. For months, she and Chad remained silent, their vacant smiles offering no answers. The horrifying truth was finally uncovered on June 9, 2020. Acting on cell phone data from Lori's now deceased brother, investigators began excavating Chad Daybell's backyard. They soon unearthed human remains. What they found was a parent's worst nightmare. Caylee's body had been dismembered, burned, and placed in a melted green bucket. JJ's small body, still in his red pajamas, was found wrapped in plastic bags and bound tightly with duct tape, buried in a shallow pet grave. They hadn't been sent away. They had been executed and disposed of like trash, allegedly because their own mother had come to believe they weren't zombies. Lori Vallow Daybell's trial was a surreal look into a mind warped by a toxic mix of religious fanaticism, greed, and a narcissistic desire for a new life. Prosecutors argued that the zombie story was just a convenient excuse. The real motive, they said, was cold and simple: money, power, and sex. Lori and Chad wanted to eliminate all obstacles, their spouses and Lori's children, so they could be together and collect the life insurance and Social Security benefits left behind. In May 2023, a jury found Lori Vallow Daybell guilty of the first-degree murders of her 2 children and of conspiring to murder Tammy Daybell. She was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, Lori Vallow Daybell is incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. Her bizarre and tragic saga of a mother-turned-cult devotee stands as one of the most disturbing and complex true crime cases of the modern era, a horrifying look at how faith, when twisted into a weapon, can become the most evil mother of all. In the age of social media, motherhood has become a public performance. The curated feeds of mummy bloggers document every milestone, every struggle, and every triumph, creating a powerful narrative of devotion for a global audience. But what if that narrative is a lie? What if the concerned posts, the heartbreaking photos, and the desperate pleas for support are not a chronicle of a child's illness, but a cover for the mother's own monstrous actions? What if the sympathy a mother craves online is being paid for with her own child's life? one spoonful of poison at a time. To her, thousands of online followers, Lacey Spears was a hero. She was the doting single mother of a perpetually sick but endlessly cheerful little boy named Garnett. On her blog, Garnett's Journey, and through constant Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram updates, she meticulously documented every moment of their lives. The posts painted a portrait of a selfless, warrior mother, navigating a world of mysterious illnesses, endless doctor's appointments, and terrifying hospital stays. Her followers saw photos of Garnett, small and frail in a hospital bed, and they showered Lacey with praise, prayers, and financial donations. She was a symbol of maternal sacrifice, but it was all a meticulously crafted, deadly illusion. The truth was that Garnett Spears was not a sick child. He was a tortured one, and the person making him sick, the source of all his pain, was his own mother. From the moment he was born, Lacey began a systematic campaign of medical child abuse, a classic and chilling case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. She invented a litany of symptoms for Garnett, from ear infections and digestive problems to seizures. She dragged him from doctor to doctor, hospital to hospital, always one step ahead of a definitive diagnosis, because the illness was a ghost, a phantom of her own creation. She lied to medical staff, claiming he couldn't hold down food, eventually convincing them to surgically implant a gastric feeding tube, or G-tube, directly into his stomach. This tube, meant to provide life-saving nutrition, became her murder weapon. It gave her direct, unregulated access to his internal organs. Lacey Spears killed her son with a salt shaker. For years, she had been force-feeding Garnett toxic, dangerously high levels of sodium through his feeding tube, causing his body to be in a constant state of distress. This chronic poisoning was the source of his seizures and his failure to thrive. Then, in January of 2014, she administered the final, fatal dose. After Garnett was admitted to a hospital in Nyack, New York for seizures, his sodium levels suddenly and inexplicably skyrocketed to a level so high it was essentially unsurvivable. As doctors frantically tried to save his life, Lacey was busy with her own performance. She updated her Facebook status with a somber message. "My sweet angel is in the hospital." She posted photos of him, pale and unconscious, and basked in the outpouring of online sympathy. But this time, the hospital was suspicious. They installed a hidden surveillance camera in Garnett's room. The footage they captured was damning. It showed Lacey taking her son, along with his feeding tube equipment, into the room's private, unmonitored bathroom. She did this twice. Each time she emerged from the bathroom, Garnett's condition would rapidly and catastrophically deteriorate, his body convulsing as the salt ravaged his brain. On January 23, 2014, 5-year-old Garnett was declared brain dead. He had been murdered by his mother for the currency of likes and online attention. The investigation that followed uncovered a mountain of digital evidence. Police seized feeding bags from her home that were heavily contaminated with salt. They found 2 different feeding tubes, one of which she had used to poison him at home. Most chillingly, they discovered her extensive internet search history. On her computer and her phone, she had made dozens of searches for terms like dangers of high sodium in children, and sodium poisoning, and what can cause seizures. She had meticulously researched the effects of her chosen poison, all while pretending to be a baffled and terrified mother. Investigators also unraveled her personal lies. She had told everyone that Garnett's father was a heroic police officer named Blake, who had died in a car accident. The truth was, Garnett's father was a man named Chris Hill, who was very much alive and had been trying for years to be a part of his son's life, only to be blocked by Lacey at every turn. In 2015, Lacey Spears was put on trial for second-degree murder. The prosecution portrayed her as a cold and calculating manipulator who had tortured her son for years, simply to be the center of attention. They argued that her social media was not a diary of a concerned mother, but the scrapbook of a killer. The defense argued that she was mentally ill and that there was no direct proof that she had administered the assault. But the video evidence, the internet searches, and the medical testimony were irrefutable. The jury found her guilty. The judge, sentencing her to 20 years to life in prison, condemned her actions with a single, powerful observation.
Instead of nurturing and protecting a beautiful child, you subjected him to 5 years of torment and pain. One does not have to be a psychologist to realize you suffer from a mental illness, known as Munchausen by proxy.
As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, Lacey Spears is incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. Her case is a uniquely modern and terrifying tragedy, a cautionary tale of a mother whose desperate need for validation in the digital world turned her into the ultimate monster, transforming her blog from Garnett's journey into a public chronicle of his slow, agonizing murder. When a child goes missing, a mother's grief is supposed to be immediate, all-consuming, and absolute. The world stops. The search begins. But what if, for 31 agonizing days, a mother says nothing? What if, while her 2-year-old daughter is gone without a trace, she parties, enters hot body contests, gets a new tattoo celebrating the good life, and weaves a fantastic web of lies for anyone who asks? This is the story of America's most hated mom, a case that captivated and infuriated a nation, ending not with justice, but with a verdict that remains one of the most controversial in modern history. In June of 2008, in Orlando, Florida, 2-year-old Caylee Anthony, a vibrant little girl with expressive brown eyes, vanished. But for an entire month, the only person who seemed unconcerned was her own mother, 22-year-old Casey Anthony. While her parents, George and Cindy Anthony, frantically tried to get in touch with her to see their granddaughter, Casey dodged their calls and offered a series of increasingly bizarre excuses. She told them she was too busy with her high-pressure job at Universal Studios, a job she didn't have. She claimed Caylee was with a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, or Zanny the Nanny, a woman who did not exist. She said they were at the beach, or at a theme park, or visiting friends. All lies. While her family worried, Casey was living her bella vita, the good life, the phrase she had tattooed on her back during the same month her daughter was missing. The house of cards came crashing down on July 15th, 2008, when Casey's mother, Cindy, finally tracked down her daughter's abandoned car. The moment she approached the vehicle, she was hit by a horrifying, overpowering stench. She later told the 911 dispatcher in a now infamous call, Seda,
"Can't find my granddaughter. She just admitted to me that she's been trying to find her herself. There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car."
That frantic call finally forced Casey to confront the police, and it officially began one of the most intense missing person investigations the country had ever seen. Faced with investigators, Casey's lies only grew more elaborate. She stuck to her story about Zenny the Nanny, claiming this fictional woman had kidnapped Caylee. She led detectives on a wild goose chase, taking them to the non-existent apartment where the nanny supposedly lived, and to the Universal Studios office where she falsely claimed to work. Every lead was a dead end, every statement a fabrication. As the search for Caylee intensified, the investigation into Casey became a homicide case. Forensic analysis of the trunk of her Pontiac Sunfire revealed evidence of human decomposition, and a single strand of hair found in the trunk showed signs of belonging to a dead body. Scientists also detected unusually high levels of chloroform, a chemical used to render a person unconscious. For months, the world watched, hoping for a miracle. That hope was extinguished in December 2008, when a utility worker discovered the skeletal remains of a small child in a wooded swamp less than half a mile from the Anthony family home. Dental records, confirmed it was Caylee. Duct tape was found wrapped around her skull, a chilling piece of evidence that suggested she had been suffocated. The trial of Casey Anthony in 2011 was not just a legal proceeding. It was a national obsession, the most watched trial since C.J. Simpson. The prosecution presented a simple, damning theory. Casey Anthony, a young woman who wanted to be free of the responsibilities of motherhood, had murdered her daughter. They argued that she used chloroform to knock Caylee out, then placed duct tape over her nose and mouth, suffocating her. She then kept the body in the trunk of her car for several days before dumping it in the woods, freeing herself to live a life of partying and boyfriends. The defense, led by attorney Jose Baez, responded with a bombshell allegation in their opening statement that changed the entire narrative of the trial. They claimed that Caylee had not been murdered at all, but had accidentally drowned in the family's swimming pool, and that a panicked Casey, along with her father George, had covered up the death. In a shocking and unproven accusation, Baez also alleged that Casey's father had sexually abused her for years, conditioning her to live in a world of secrets and lies. The trial became a brutal, psychological war, pitting daughter against father and turning a murder case into a twisted family drama. On July 5, 2011, after deliberating for less than 11 hours, the jury delivered a verdict that stunned the world. They found Casey Anthony not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, and aggravated child abuse. She was convicted only on 4 minor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The verdict was met with a tidal wave of public fury. Protests erupted outside the courthouse. Legal analysts were baffled. Casey Anthony was dubbed America's most hated mom. Due to time already served, she was released from jail just days later. As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, Casey Anthony lives a reclusive life in South Florida, forever defined by the case that made her a household name. To this day, the world does not know for sure what happened to Caylee Anthony in her final hours, but the court of public opinion has delivered its own verdict, and it is a story of a mother's unthinkable deception and a little girl who was denied justice. Every family has its secrets, the quiet burdens and unspoken truths hidden away in closets or tucked into the dark corners of the garage. But what if the secret is not an old diary or a forgotten debt, but a collection of small, sealed cardboard boxes? What if a mother, over the course of a decade, secretly gave birth to 6 babies, murdered each one in the moments after they were born, and then packed their tiny bodies away, living her life for years, just feet from her own private, hidden graveyard? To her neighbors in the quiet, predominantly Mormon community of Pleasant Grove, Utah, Megan Huntsman was an unremarkable figure. She was a wife and a mother to 3 school-aged daughters. While she had a reputation for drinking too much, no one could have possibly imagined the monstrous secret she was keeping. Her life appeared to be one of ordinary, domestic routine. But for 10 years, between 1996 and 2006, her home was the setting for a repeated, silent, and horrifying ritual of birth and death. The horrifying truth was unearthed on April 12, 2014. Her estranged husband, Darren West, who had recently been released from federal prison on drug charges, was cleaning out the garage of the home they had once shared. As he sorted through years of accumulated clutter, he came across a small, taped-up cardboard box. Curious, he cut it open. Inside, wrapped in a towel and a plastic bag, was the perfectly preserved, decomposing body of a newborn infant. Horrified, he immediately called the police. When investigators arrived, they began a methodical search of the garage. What they found would shock even the most seasoned homicide detectives. They found another box, and then another. By the end of the day, they had recovered the remains of 7 infants, each packed away in its own small tomb. Megan Huntsman was located and arrested that same day. In a calm, almost detached confession, she unburdened herself of a decade-long secret that defied all human comprehension. She told investigators that between 1996 and 2006, she had given birth to 7 babies in secret. She claimed that the first infant was stillborn, but the other 6, she admitted, she had either strangled or suffocated immediately after they were born. She would then wrap their bodies, place them in boxes, and hide them in the garage. Her motive, she claimed, was a grim and selfish practicality. She was severely addicted to methamphetamines and alcohol, and she felt she was too consumed by her addiction to care for any more children. She didn't know what else to do, so she killed them. Perhaps the most baffling part of her story was how she managed to conceal 7 full-term pregnancies from everyone in her life, including her husband and her 3 living daughters, all while sharing the same small house. Darren West told police he knew his wife had a serious drinking problem and that her weight fluctuated, but he insisted he had no idea she was ever pregnant. Her ability to hide her condition, give birth in secret, commit acepharos, all while maintaining the facade of a normal life, revealed a capacity for deception and compartmentalization that was almost inhuman. For 10 years, her children played in a yard just feet away from the garage where the bodies of their murdered siblings were hidden. The forensic investigation confirmed the horror. DNA testing proved that all 7 infants were fathered by Darren West. The state of decomposition made it impossible to determine the exact cause of death for each child, but the evidence, combined with Huntsman's own confession, painted a clear picture of serial murder. The community of Pleasant Grove was left reeling, struggling to understand how such a thing could happen in their quiet town, right under their noses. Faced with the possibility of the death penalty, Megan Huntsman chose to plead guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder, sparing her family, especially her surviving daughters, the trauma of a public trial. At her sentencing hearing in 2015, the judge's words captured the absolute horror of her crimes, calling her actions incredibly, utterly, horribly cold. He sentenced her to the maximum penalty allowed under her plea agreement, at least 30 years and up to life in prison, ensuring that she will likely die behind bars. During the hearing, Huntsman briefly spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she said, but offered no further explanation. As of Tuesday, August 26, 2025, Megan Huntsman is incarcerated at the Utah State Prison. Her case remains one of the most prolific and disturbing examples of neonaticide in American history. She was not a mother who snapped in a single tragic moment of psychosis or despair. She was a serial killer whose victims were her own children, a woman who chose murder as a form of birth control, again and again, for an entire decade. From the mother who lied to a nation to the one who killed for a cult, the stories of these 10 women represent the ultimate betrayal of the maternal bond. They are the healers who harmed, the protectors who prayed, and their crimes leave a permanent scar on our understanding of human nature. They are, without question, among the most evil mothers in prison today. If you found this exploration into these shocking cases compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share your thoughts on these stories in the comments below. Which case did you find the most disturbing?